Savannah Guthrie's mother, Nancy Guthrie, missing day 45. This as we learn of reports that the Guthrie family passed polygraphs with flying colors. Not only that, 2 days emerging, January 11 and January 24. They're significant, but why? Also, new images. You predicted there would be more images from Nancy's home. Now we're learning they're of the pool area. And Nano says, oh, they're irrelevant. Really? Then why did we see aerial footage of the FBI combing the pool area and even taking pictures? Good evening. I'm Nancy Grace. This is Crime Stories. I want to thank you for being with us. Straight out to Crime Stories investigative reporter Dave Mack. We are now learning of reports the Guthrie family, each one, including Savannah, including Annie Guthrie, her sister, including the brother-in-law, much maligned, have passed polygraphs. What do you know?
Nancy, what we know right now is a former SWAT commander with a source inside Pima County Sheriff's Office says that the Guthrie family, the children and their spouses, were all polygraphed and passed the polygraph test with flying colors.
Wow. Dave Mack, thank you for that. I want to go out to a special guest joining us right now. It's George Olivo. He is a certified polygrapher. He is former FBI, and you may have actually seen him over at our E because he is the polygrapher that polygraphed the Casey Anthony family. Now, there's George Anthony getting polygraphed. Remember, his daughter, Tot Mom Casey Anthony, accused him of wrongdoing, of all sorts of crimes in the Tot Mom murder case of her daughter, Kelly Anthony. George Olivo is the one that performed all the polygraphs for A&E's Casey Anthony, the parents' lie detector test. And then you went on to create another A&E program. What was the name of it, George?
That was called a lie detector, truth or deception. That was a series that was patterned after the Casey Anthony show.
Mm-hmm. I can't believe people are dumb enough to hook themselves up to one of your polys, George Olivo. George Olivo is based in L.A., and as I said, former FBI. Now, before everybody starts screaming, they're not allowed in court. Polygraphs are allowed in court. They are routinely allowed without a problem in civil cases, and they are allowed in criminal cases if they are stipulated or agreed upon before the poly. Both sides have to say, in writing, yes, we'll allow the poly in the criminal case. We agree, and then you perform the poly before you know the outcome. How does it work? Break it down for people that have never been present or never conducted or subjected to a polygraph.
Sure, Nancy. Well, the polygraph there's nothing on the screen that shows up and says you're lying or you're telling the truth. Really, if you really want to look at it more than people calling it a lie detector test, it's really more of a stress detector test. And so we're looking at physiology, and at the end of the day, when we say someone passed, what we're saying is that they had no significant response to the relevant questions. And so we're inferring that because of that they're telling the truth. Now, when there's a significant response, then we say that there's a reason for that. Their reactions don't happen in a vacuum. So when they react repeatedly over and over to the same question, because there's redundancy built into the protocol, when they keep reacting to the same question, then we infer that there's deception indicated there.
So have you ever visibly seen them react, George Olivo? Like, do they start sweating? Do they glance around nervously? Do they twitch? Do they get a nervous tick? Can you actually see them reacting when your poly is going zzz?
2 dates. That's all it took to change everything in Nancy Guthrie's case. When Nancy Grace looked at the timeline, she didn't focus on the day Nancy disappeared. She focused on what happened before it, Because in cases like this, the truth usually hides in the days leading up to the moment everything goes wrong. Before we go further, Crime Talk, I want to hear from you. Drop where you're watching from in the comments, and if you care about real cases like this, make sure you subscribe. Because this story only gets deeper. Nancy Guthrie wasn't living a risky life. There were no obvious threats, no public conflicts, nothing that suggested she would suddenly vanish. That's what made investigators slow down and start looking closer at her final days instead of just the day she disappeared. The first date that stood out came 3 days before she was last seen. On that day, her phone activity changed. Not slightly, noticeably. She was in repeated contact with a number that didn't belong to family, friends, or coworkers. It wasn't saved in her phone, which already raised questions. People don't usually have that level of communication with someone they don't even bother to name. Calls, messages, back and forth within a short period. And then nothing. No follow-up the next day. No continuation. Just a sudden stop, like whatever needed to be said had already been said. Investigators couldn't ignore that. Then came the second date, the night before Nancy disappeared. That's when someone reported seeing a vehicle parked near her home. It wasn't recognized. It wasn't moving. It was just there, sitting longer than normal, long enough to feel out of place. At the time, it didn't trigger alarm, but after Nancy went missing, that detail came back with weight. When investigators matched the timeline, something didn't sit right. The unknown number Nancy had been contacting days earlier connected to a cell tower in the same area that night. That meant one thing. Whoever she had been speaking to wasn't just someone on the phone. They were close. And that's where the case began to shift from a disappearance to something far more deliberate. The closer investigators looked at those 2 dates, the less this felt like coincidence, and the more it started to look like a setup. Nancy Grace pointed out something most people would have missed. That unknown number didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was used with precision. After the burst of calls 3 days before Nancy Guthrie vanished, the number went completely quiet. No casual follow-ups, no random activity. It was as if its only purpose had already been fulfilled. Then investigators dug deeper. That phone wasn't tied to a contract. It wasn't linked to a known identity. It had been activated shortly before those calls and would later be shut down just as quickly. In other words, it behaved exactly like something meant to avoid being traced. But it didn't completely disappear. Cell tower data placed that same phone near Nancy's area on the night before she vanished. The same night, the unfamiliar car was seen sitting nearby. That overlap changed everything. Now it wasn't just about suspicious communication. It was about presence. Someone she had been in contact with days earlier was physically close to her home just hours before she disappeared. And that raised a new question. Was that meeting planned? Because when investigators reviewed Nancy's movements that evening, there were gaps. Small ones, but enough to matter. Moments where her exact whereabouts couldn't be fully accounted for. Moments where something or someone could have entered the picture. There were no signs of struggle reported. No immediate evidence of forced entry. That detail alone made the situation even more troubling. It suggested one possibility investigators couldn't ignore. She may have opened the door herself. Nancy Grace emphasized that point carefully. Cases like this often hinge on trust, on a victim believing they're safe in a moment when they're not. And if that's what happened here, then the person behind that phone wasn't a stranger in the usual sense. They were someone familiar enough, or convincing enough, to get close without raising alarm. By the end of that second date, the night before everything went silent, the pattern was clear. Contact had been made, proximity had been established. And whatever happened next was no accident. If you're following this closely, Drop where you're watching from and share what you think. Was this someone Nancy knew, or someone who planned every step? As the investigation moved forward, the focus stayed locked on those 2 dates, because everything kept leading back to them. Nancy Grace broke it down clearly. The calls 3 days before Nancy Guthrie vanished weren't random. They were the beginning of something. Investigators eventually confirmed that the number she had been communicating with came from a recently activated phone, one that had no long-term history and no personal ties on record. That alone raised suspicion. But what changed the direction of the case was what came next. Using store surveillance and transaction data, investigators were able to trace the purchase of that phone. The person who bought it didn't stand out at first, just another face in a routine transaction, but they made a small mistake that left a trail. That trail led to someone who had crossed paths with Nancy before. Not a close friend, not family, but not a stranger either. Someone just outside her immediate circle. Once that connection was made, the timeline started to make sense. The sudden burst of communication wasn't casual, it was intentional. Something was being arranged, discussed, or set into motion during that short window. Then came the second date, the night before she disappeared. Location data placed that same phone near Nancy's home. The unidentified car seen in the area now had context. It likely wasn't random. It was connected. And the most important detail: there were no clear signs of forced entry or struggle. Investigators began to believe Nancy may have willingly interacted with whoever was behind that phone. That suggested a level of trust, or at least familiarity strong enough to lower her guard. Shortly after that night, the phone was deactivated. Completely silent, no further signals, no activity. That action alone reinforced the idea that this wasn't impulsive. It pointed toward planning, using the phone only for a specific purpose, then disposing of it once that purpose was fulfilled. Further analysis uncovered digital behavior linked to the same individual, search patterns that suggested preparation, awareness of tracking, and attempts to avoid leaving evidence behind. Piece by piece, the case shifted. What started as a disappearance began to look more like a calculated act involving timing, controlled communication, and physical presence at exactly the right moment. And yet, despite all of that, Nancy Guthrie still hasn't been found. No confirmed location, no recovery, no final answers. Which leaves investigators, and everyone following the case, with one haunting reality. Those 2 dates don't just mark when things happened. They reveal that whatever led to her disappearance was already in motion days before she was ever reported missing. If you've been following this, drop where you're watching from and make sure you subscribe. Because cases like this don't stay silent forever.
You're right, Scott Eicher. And to Brian Fitzgibbons, there's many, a plethora of financial scams to siphon money, steal money from the elderly. It doesn't have to be going to an ATM. It could be any number of things. It could be them calling their financial planner and asking for money to be moved. So there's a myriad of things that a financial scam could entail. In this case, have they found evidence of those financial scams? And is there a money trail that could lead us to the perp? Or is this straight out for ransom? Ransom gone wrong?
Yeah, in my opinion, right, this leads more to ransom. Not many of these financial scams, at least ones that take place face to face, are going to happen at 2 a.m. over a weekend. This is those are very typically, especially with the elderly, are going to happen in broad daylight when banks are open, when access codes can be granted to ATMs and things like that. For this to happen at 2 a.m. Leads me to believe that this is more towards the ransom gone wrong than a direct financial scam targeting an elderly woman.
If you know or think you know anything about Miss Guthrie's disappearance, please call toll-free 800-225-5324. Repeat, 800-225-5324. That is 800-CALL-FBI. Or, if you wish to remain anonymous in your call, 520-882-7463. 520-882-7463. There is a $1.2 plus million reward for information leading to the whereabouts of Nancy Guthrie. $1.2 plus million reward. An arrest or a conviction is not required for you to get the reward money. $1.2 million. Thank you to our guests, but especially to you for being with us tonight and keeping the search for Nancy Guthrie, a beloved mother, a beloved grandmother, alive. Nancy Grace signing off for tonight, but I'll see you tomorrow night. And until then, good night, friends.